53-year-old choir director Kathy Blair is approaching the busiest time in the calendar.
Kathy was always excited about the Christmas concert. That was our big concert of the year. The choir was her whole life. It was her passion project. She firmly believed that music makes life better.
Peace. Very nice. Little low, though, okay? We're gonna readjust.
She became very much a mother figure to me, somebody that I felt like I could go to consistently.
She taught thousands, actually thousands of kids. And she knew them all by name, and she cared about all of them. She cared about being there for all of you, not just for the creative side or the musical side, but for whatever you needed.
That was it. Feel great? You should. Hi, honey.
Hi, how was rehearsal?
Kathy's 23-year-old son, Joe, has just been accepted into naval school.
Actually, a couple of the guys and I were gonna go out for some drinks to celebrate.
Without me. You have a good time.
Hey, I need you to come to my house right away.
What's happening next, sir?
Steve, my mom is dead. He's gonna go cancer. He killed my mom.
What's your mom's name?
Her name is Kathy Blair.
Also, 911 received a call from a caller that said that his mother was injured and needed police and EMS. When patrol officers got there and entered the house, they found the caller's mother was deceased.
Detective Derek Israel is called to take charge of the scene.
I was on call with the homicide unit. It was an ordinary middle-class home.
Is this the son?
The first thing I did when I got out there was to talk to the son of the deceased. He had been at a friend's house, and when he returned, he had come in to find his mother dead.
Go with you, officer.
Detective Scanlon came out.
Where's the victim? In the house.
The first thing that I wanted to do is find out, is this a murder? Is it an accidental death, something else? The house was very neatly kept. It was well maintained, it was clean. When we got in, we found that Kathy Blair was laying on the floor next to the bed. And I saw what I immediately recognized to be stab wounds. It was clear that this was a murder.
The crime scene within the bedroom was like a very chaotic scene.
It was clear that there was a very dynamic and very violent struggle. It looked like she was kicking at her attacker, and her attacker stabbed her in the legs. And at some point, the attacker was able to get behind her and inflict the final wounds, which were slashing wounds, so on her neck.
Detective Israel pointed out to me that there's drawers from a jewelry cabinet sitting on the floor. They're all empty.
There were blood stains on the drawers. That told me that that jewelry was stolen after the murder, because there was no blood before the murder. Also, we saw blood on a pillow that was missing a pillowcase in Kathy Blair's son's room.
So we're assuming that the pillowcase was used to carry out whatever was in the jewelry cabinet.
It's very unusual in my experience to find burglars who steal jewelry. Why would you steal a bunch of stuff that could be worth 50 cents when you could just take a laptop or a TV that you know what the value of that is? So that made it very unusual.
Forensics officers use UV lights and special chemicals to reveal potential clues.
When you have a bloody scene, it can lead to a lot of very helpful evidence. Blood is like ink. If you step in blood, then your shoe is like a stamp.
The shoe size was roughly a men's 10.
We were able to essentially track the killer as he moved throughout the house after the murder. We saw the footprints walk right up to the table that contained a bunch of what would normally be items stolen in burglaries, laptops, Kindles, other electronic items that could easily be sold for money. And then those bloody shoe impressions walked right out the back door.
The overlooked electrical goods leave detectives with a nagging thought.
There is a sense that this may be a staged burglary and therefore a targeted attack, in that Kathy was the victim of a murder by somebody that she knew, who then tried to stage the scene to look like a burglary had occurred.
Did your mom keep the door locked at night?
No.
There was no sign of forced entry to the house. Our initial hypothesis was that the killer had entered through the unlocked back door.
That leads us to believe that the attacker maybe had prior knowledge that Kathy doesn't normally lock the door. I am thinking about who are the people closest to Kathy Blair, and I'm going to know how their relationships were at the time that this happened.
Detective Scanlon finds out that Kathy Blair was recently divorced, and her ex-husband lives an hour away.
I had somebody tell me that when she moved in to her new house, she didn't want him to know where it was at.
So we went to find out where he was and to either rule him in or rule him out as a suspect. The biggest thing you have going for you as a homicide investigator is that almost always a person is murdered by someone they know.
Hi, my name is Detective Scanlon. Where were you last night?
The ex-husband's alibi was that he was with his new girlfriend and they were like camping in an RV park in an area of Texas that was considerably further south, which we did later confirm.
Thank you very much for your time.
And just based on that and the lack of any other evidence linking him to it, he very quickly fell down the list of possible suspects.
Just as the investigation seems to hit a sudden dead end, Detective Israel receives an unexpected voicemail.
I get a call from a neighbor of Kathy's named Rob Leaf.
He was very bothered by the idea that a single woman was attacked in the middle of the night in his neighborhood.
He calls me to tell me that I need to come over to his house because he's got something I need to see. He was out in his neighborhood late at night testing out this new thermal imaging scope that he had.
Okay, let's see what you got.
He knew late at night there's deer all over his neighborhood, so he took it out and to get some video of these deer.
What is that? Can you zoom in?
So while Rob Leaf was out taking video, a car pulled up.
Okay, keep playing.
It was about 2 blocks away, but because this is rifle scope, he was able to zoom in electronically. And the time on that was 1:16 a.m. in a very quiet neighborhood.
Who's that? Punch it.
Rob says the person got out of the car and walked all the way down the block and then turned onto Kathy Blair's street.
Can you rewind?
So my first thought is, this could be the killer.
The most peculiar thing about the video was just the way the guy walked. He has a very particular gait to his walk. It is something very distinct about him in particular, and he looks pretty tall.
We were very excited about it, but it was also very frustrating.
The detail that you're going to get from a thermal image is only going to be images of heat.
It did, though, tell us some very important things. First of all, the suspect was driving a car.
Pause there.
The car does have some distinct characteristics about it like headlight shapes, you know, the grill, the low profile. So these are some things that we can look for.
As the investigation steps up, people close to Kathy Blair are still stunned.
I didn't know how to process it or understand it. I thought she was going to be there forever.
I was feeling so despondent. We had very little information, and it felt very confusing. We wanted the police department, the investigators, to find whoever had done this.
Israel.
A friend of Kathy Blair's had called us to let us know about something strange that had happened. A friend had arranged a little memorial at a local restaurant to just informally share their stories about her life. And suddenly this person no one recognized stood up and said, well, I didn't know Kathy Blair like y'all did, but I feel really bad for the fact that she's dead.
And of course, everybody in the room was like, who is this guy? You know, it is a little odd.
It turns out that one of the people who was there remembered that she had seen this person before because he was a cashier at a local department store.
Detectives head to the store and find the individual.
I'm Detective Israel, and this is Detective Scallion. Can we ask you a few questions about the murder?
We explained to him why people were suspicious, why we were talking to him.
I saw it on the news. I just wanted to pay my respects to her.
He gave us his whole timeline. At the time that Kathy Blair was murdered, he was in San Antonio.
But we followed him home, determined what kind of car that he drove.
This guy had a car that could be something like what's in that thermal imaging video.
Can you come meet us somewhere?
Detective Scanlon calls Rob Leaf, the man with the thermal imaging camera.
We want to just have you video this car and see if this looks like the car from night of the murder.
Let's see the car outside Kathy's house.
Rob Leaf has sent footage of the potential suspect's car.
Are they the same?
Well, once we actually finally looked at the video, it did not look anything like it.
It's completely different.
I hate to say it, it's kind of disappointing. But you have to follow the evidence, and in this case, the evidence didn't show that this guy was involved.
Israel?
Shortly after, Detective Israel receives some disturbing news.
Scanlon, we've got another murder. What have you got?
The victims in this case were two elderly individuals, a husband and wife, named Sidney and Billy Shelton. This was a very vulnerable pair of individuals, and they were both found in their bed. I saw that there was a knife sticking out of the eye of Billy Shelton, the female victim of this case. This was clearly a murder perpetrated by a person who is simply sadistic and enjoys the act of murder.
It was shocking. It really was. The Sheltons had been together probably close to 60 years. Sidney Shelton was a very kind man, never a negative word from him. Billy was very talkative, very sweet, bubbly. They were just quiet and modest. Everybody knew them. Everybody knew the Sheltons in that neighborhood.
Mrs. Shelton had a small jewelry box, and all the drawers had been removed from that and stacked up as well, just like a miniature version of what I saw in Kathy Blair's house.
The similarities between the two crimes are alarming.
Nighttime burglaries are extremely unusual. This is Texas. People have guns, and they're allowed to shoot you when you come in the house and burglarize it at night.
The new crime scene is just a 15-minute drive from Kathy Blair's home.
For two such burglaries to happen in such a short period of time, it made me and Detective Scanlon firmly believe that we're looking for the same person in both these cases.
Detectives fear that instead of a burglar, this could be the work of a serial killer.
We realized that the clock was working against us.
We can't wait and let another murder happen.
If we could figure out a link between these victims, we felt that sitting right at that link would be our killer. We began the painstaking and slow process of looking to see, do they have the same dentist? Do they have the same dog groomer? Do they have the same pizza delivery person? Anything that might connect these people together. One of the people who Detective Scanlon spoke to mentioned that back in May, Kathy had a handyman come to her house, and this guy kind of creeped her out.
I said, do you remember that guy's name? And he goes, well, yeah, I absolutely do. The guy's name was Tim Parlin. He told me that Tim had been in prison.
Timothy Parlin did work back in May for Kathy Blair. He was also a member of the Shelton's Church.
What we learned from researching Tim Parlin was very disturbing. Parlin was arrested back in 1993 for a burglary in the middle of the night. And also what was interesting about this burglary was that he had an accomplice.
He had told his accomplice, if these people come home or wake up or something and confront us, you're just gonna have to kill them. That to me was like really consistent with the two murder scenes that we were looking at.
The detectives head to the In-Town Suites, a long-stay hotel where Tim Parlin is living with his wife. Parlin recently reported one of his two minivans had been stolen.
Timothy Parlin? Yes?
It was clear that we were homicide detectives. Detective Scanlon, who was with me, was wearing a jacket that said Austin Police Homicide on it.
Aren't you guys here about my stolen car?
We're like, that's not why we're here to talk to you.
He didn't seem fazed by the fact that he's talking to two homicide detectives.
The detectives tell Parlin they are contacting people who were connected to both Kathy Blair and the Sheltons.
He was cooperative. He didn't seem like he was nervous.
We asked, can we search your van? I said, absolutely, you can search my van. He found some old knives, rusty knives. It didn't look likely that these were our murder weapon. So we said, hey, could we take DNA? And he said, sure, I'll give you a sample of my DNA. And we took a swab right there.
What were you doing between midnight and 4 a.m. on December 6th?
He said he was working at 7-Eleven, which was right up the road from where he was staying at that motel.
And we also asked about his room, and could we go look in his room? And there, Tim Parlin didn't want to cooperate with this. He said, my wife works nights, and she's asleep right now. I don't want to disturb her. So, of course, we're working on Tim Parlin's voluntary cooperation. So if he doesn't want us to search the room, we can't search the room. So we concluded our interview with Tim Parlin. It wasn't until the next day that we were able to go over to the 7-Eleven to talk to the manager.
Did an employee called Timothy Parlin work here on the 6th of December?
They advised that Tim Parlin was terminated from the store a week before the murder happened.
Now we had him lying about what he was doing that night. And suddenly Timothy Parlin became our prime suspect. And I want to search his apartment.
The detectives hatch a plan to get inside.
While Tim was gone, Detective Israel went to try to talk to his wife, Anna Parlin.
We're investigating a murder that took place.
His wife answered. And I explained what we were investigating. She was very upset about the murder of the Sheltons, and in fact, she told us that if Tim Parlin had anything to do with it, that she would divorce him.
Did your husband give you the necklace you're wearing?
He did.
She gave us permission to search the hotel room where they were staying. We found some other little pieces of jewelry, and we found some prescription drugs in a pocket of one of Tim Parlin's jackets, which he didn't have a prescription for. And finally, we found a pawn receipt from an item of jewelry that Tim Parlin pawned on December 6th, the night of Kathy Blair's murder.
Detectives have seen enough. They bring Parlin into the station for questioning.
So we talked about maybe what you might have been doing or if you had been working, and you said you thought maybe you may have been working that day. So,
or I was with my wife, one or the other.
So we went to the work. And
I was still employed there at that
yeah,
time.
and you weren't. So you weren't employed, and you weren't working during that week. And we're, conducting a murder investigation. Here's an interesting thing, okay? You have Kathy Blair, right? You were over at her house. Here's the deal, too, okay? Weird coincidence. The Sheltons, you also have a connection to the Sheltons, too.
Are you liking me for this thing, or are you liking to try to, make sure that I'm not liked for this thing?
What I'm trying to do is, if you did it, I want to get the proof on it. If you didn't do it, I want to get you out of the way as soon as I possibly can.
Yeah, I want to do the same thing.
And here's what I
didn't do it.
Okay, I get it. He had to control the conversation when he was being interviewed, to redirect the questioning.
I have a curiosity question. You took 4 knives out of my van. I allowed you to take them.
Mm-hmm.
Shouldn't that be on the expediency list? Because I allowed you to do it.
Sure. And it was very hard to get around this anytime that you were talking to him. But at that point, we did not have enough to charge him with the murder. All right, just stay here, okay?
Timothy Parlin, however, remains a major suspect. Despite their grief, Kathy Blair's colleagues and students hold the concert in her memory.
They invited everybody who had ever been a student of hers to come up and sing. And the risers were just full of people. And so I got up and I tried to, but I was just crying the whole time, so I don't think I actually sang a note. The choir was her whole life. It was her passion project. It was the thing she believed in the most. All she thought about was getting music to as many kids as possible.
There was a piece of jewelry that Tim Parlin had pawned the evening after we found Kathy Blair's body. It was like a gold nugget pendant. We showed a photograph of that pawn receipt to Kathy Blair's son and to the Shelton family, and they didn't recognize it.
But detectives want to find out if Timothy Parlin did pawn anything belonging to the murder victims that evening.
When we got to the pawn shop, there was an outdoor camera that recorded the vehicles in their parking lot. And there was an inside camera that recorded the actual transaction at the counter.
Detectives cue the footage up to 7 p.m., just before the pawn transaction was made.
Is that him?
That's our guy. Stop. Rewind. Zoom in.
When he made that pawn transaction, we didn't see any evidence of more than one piece of jewelry.
Switch to exterior cameras.
Tim Parlin pawns a necklace and leaves the store.
Freeze that image.
Zoom in.
Parlin said he only drove a van, so how come he's in a car?
Tim Parlin, if nothing else, is a great liar. He wasn't driving a van, he was driving a car.
Detectives compare the vehicle to the footage filmed by Rob Leaf on the night of the murder.
From the angle that I'm looking at it, it could be a car that, matches what is in the thermal imaging video.
That led us back to Tim Parlin's hotel where he was staying. We started talking to people there, staff members who worked there, and we asked them, do you remember Tim Parlin ever driving something besides a van? And a couple people said, yes, he was driving a green car, and I think it was a Toyota. I called one of the detectives who works in our strategic intelligence unit, and very quickly she came back and said, well, his sister has a green Toyota.
Tim Parlin's sister allows police to examine the car back at the department garage.
One of our crime scene technicians started processing the car, and she observed some reddish-brown stains in the passenger side of the car, down in the footwell where your feet go, and on the front of the seat, like where the back of your legs might touch it.
The stains were swabbed. They were later submitted to our DNA lab, and they were processed and profiled.
The results come back. The marks are blood.
What we found out very quickly was the blood in the green Toyota Camry that Tim Parlin had been driving was from Kathy Blair. We knew we had our guy. Issue a warrant for Tim Parlin, wanted to bring him in and talk to him. And this time I confronted him.
Here's the deal. Okay? You got blood of murder victim in the car. All this evidence, and it goes right down and points at people.
I had him rock solid. So I'm expecting Timothy Parlin to tell me some sob story about why he did this.
But Parlin has other ideas.
His mind starts thinking, and he says, well, I didn't do it, but I know who did. That kind of helped you out right now, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, you're still going to throw me in a pokey.
Yeah, but in the end, it all sorts out. If those guys did it, and you give me that information, how could I possibly charge you?
All right, that's recorded what you just said.
Yeah, absolutely. Every word I say.
Okay. You already got his sister here in jail already.
Okay. Tell me more.
Sean Gant. That's it.
He said the guy who did the murders was named Sean Gant Benalcazar. I knew Tim would have no trouble just making up a name. Now I'm left with the situation that I have to figure out who Sean Gant Benalcazar is, find him, clear him of any wrongdoing, and then I can charge Tim Parlin. Tim Parlin said that Sean's sister was a Vanessa Benalcazar, who was incarcerated at the Travis County Jail. So I went and talked to her.
So why are you in here?
She had severe substance abuse issues with methamphetamines. And we learned she was in jail after a disturbance that she had with an individual.
Did you ever talk to Timothy Parlin?
And what she told me was, Tim Parlin is always talking about doing burglaries. Tim Parlin is always trying to recruit people to do burglaries.
Do you know where Sean lives?
What I learned is that Sean doesn't even live in Austin. Sean lives in Galveston. Galveston's 3 hours away from Austin. This guy had no criminal background. In fact, he was a very unlikely candidate to be a murderer. He had a degree from the University of Texas. And I figured, well, I could probably knock this guy out just with a phone call.
Hello, is this Sean?
He answers the phone, and I introduce myself.
When's the last time you were in Austin?
He finally gives me a date. It's the date of Kathy Blair's murder, that weekend. And the next date he gives me is the date when the Sheltons were murdered. I'm like, oh, you gotta be kidding me. So now I have two possible suspects. One guy who I know is a bad dude, and I have another guy who's never done anything bad that I could tell in his whole life.
Detectives bring Sean Gant Benalcazar in.
We always wouldn't be comfortable.
They want details on his trips to Austin.
Sean starts describing how he was going to stay with Tim.
I was down there basically to figure out what was going on with my sister.
Right.
I'm fairly certain I came in at about 11 o'clock on the 5th. And, yeah, I met with him briefly, and he said that his girlfriend or wife or whatever was in the room, so I couldn't go in. So to go off and do whatever.
Sean said that when he got to Austin, after driving 4.5 hours, Tim Parlin told Sean to go and make himself busy for a couple hours. It just doesn't make sense. Now we're starting to think maybe Sean's trying to cover something for Tim Parlin.
So one technique that we used was simply to say, okay, great. This is going to be really easy for us to figure out if you're telling the truth, because we're going to get your cell phone data.
And that data actually allows us to pinpoint the location of a phone at any given time. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we do the same thing with Tim's phone.
So they continue, and the story changes a little bit.
He's like, oh, wait, well, hold on. Well, actually, Tim wanted to go and visit someone, so we went and visited.
He'd, park in front of people's houses.
So did he stop and get out of the car?
So he got out and, went over to the house for a few minutes.
Do you remember the name of the street?
No, I never remember street names.
I said, what did you think he was doing? Oh, well, I knew he was casing a house or going into a house.
Did you get out of the car too?
No.
I said, okay, was he carrying anything when he came back? Yes, I think he was carrying something. What was he carrying? Well, he was carrying a white bag. It had blood all over it. And what did he do with the white bag?
Well, he just threw it in the back seat and didn't say anything about it. And I was like, half asleep. So I was just like, whatever, are we going?
He was getting more nervous as it went on. One point, he takes the jacket off because he's getting hotter as he's getting more concerned about how things are going. We get to the point where a few hours into this interview, and everyone's tired, and we're like, let's take a break. Does anyone need to use the restroom? So we all get up, we all go out of the room, and Sean walks to the restroom.
And I looked up as everybody's walking in front of me, and I see Sean Campanavazar's walk. The gait, the broadness of his shoulders, the very deliberate steps. Israel. And it just hit me right there in the hall. Oh, wow. This is the guy that was in the video. Yes.
When you look at the shape of the individual, these square shoulders, very different than Tim Parlin, who's a bigger guy, he's shorter, he's a little rounder, and just the way they carry themselves. It was clear that that video was Sean and not Tim Parlin. And once we realized that, it changed everything. When Sean came back into the interview room and sat down, then we started questioning him based on that thought.
What were you wearing?
Pants and a long sleeve shirt.
What size of those?
I don't know, 11 probably.
The same as the impression that we found at Kathy Blair's.
So where are you sitting in the car?
Passenger seat.
Gant and Alcazar said that Parlin threw a bloody bag in the back seat.
And I said, well, here's the problem. So we've looked at that car and there's not blood in the back seat. There's only blood in the front seat.
And when you're sitting in that seat, and the person who's sitting in that seat had blood on them, that would make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the person sitting in that seat must have been the murderer.
I mean, what are you saying?
What we're saying is you went in the house. That's what we're saying. And we can prove that, okay? If your cell phone shows you inside the house, you have to explain it.
I was afraid of the guy.
Right.
He was threatening my family, okay? I didn't want my family in jeopardy.
Okay.
And we're close, and I couldn't let that happen. I mean, he told me to go in the house and get the stuff. And so I snuck in and she was fast asleep. She woke up and I stabbed her in the neck. I didn't even want to do it, but I was trying to get the jewelry without doing it.
So I was elated to have this confession from Sean.
All right, so this is what we're gonna do. So what we're gonna need to do for right now is we're gonna place you under arrest for capital murder.
After reading him his rights, he was asking him, well, let's talk about, the Sheltons. And that's when Sean said, I don't want to talk anymore.
The big question, of course, is why Kathy Blair? Why Billy and Sidney Shelton? Why would these people be murdered?
Detective Israel takes Tim Parlin out of jail for answers.
The first thing I did was apologize to him. And I said, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I've checked out your story and you're right. Sean's confessed to this murder.
But Parlin rejects the idea that he coerced his accomplice into the robbery and murder and claims he was caught up in Sean Gant Ben-Alcazar's own revenge mission.
Tim Parlin said Sean was upset at an individual who had gotten his sister in some trouble, and he decided he wanted to kill that guy. And he lived in Austin. So they hatched this plan, and that is they would start killing people so it looked like a random serial killer murdering people in Austin, stealing jewelry and other items. And then when they killed the actual people they wanted to kill, no one would connect it to them.
Parlin says he had viewed Kathy Blair and the Sheltons as easy targets for burglary, but claims Sean Gant Ben-Alcazar wanted to murder them as part of his cover-up.
Now, bear in mind this comes from Tim Parlin, who is a pathological liar, so who knows?
Though the main driver behind the murders remains unconfirmed, Texas law demands that people complicit in a crime are held equally responsible. Timothy Parlin is found guilty in all 3 murders. With insufficient evidence linking Sean Gant Ben-Alcazar to the Sheltons, he is found guilty only for the murder of Kathy Blair. Both are sentenced to life. No one else was found to be involved.
We were totally wrong. Tim Parlin, although was completely culpable, he was not the one who had actually gone in and committed Kathy Blair's murder. It was Sean.
The thermal camera captures Parlin's car on Kathy Blair's block and Sean Gant Ben-Alcazar walking towards her house.
He entered through the unlocked back door. And went into Kathy Blair's bedroom. Kathy Blair spent her final moments on Earth, having no idea why she was being attacked.
Then he staged the scene to look like a burglary had occurred. All very similar to the Sheltons' murder.
Somehow, 2 of the cruelest individuals got together and hatched this plan. No one really gained anything from the death of Kathy Blair, from the Sheltons. It was meaningless. Getting Sean and Tim off the streets is probably one of the most important accomplishments that I had in my police career.
I doubt I'll ever forget the really, key elements of it, people involved, beginning with the victims, of course.
I look at the mugshots of the people that did it, and I don't see people. I just see animals, because I don't understand how any human being could have done that to anybody, but especially to her. And finding any part of my heart that can forgive them has not happened yet.
I like to remember Sidney and Billy just for the good life that they lived and the happy life that they lived, and their children and their the family that they had and the love that they had for each other.
I still have Kathy's name on my resume because even if people don't recognize the name, I want anybody who sees me as a musician to know that I started with Kathy.
Austin 911, do you need police? Hey, there was an explosion!
This is just unprecedented. We had multiple bombs.
This guy knows what he's doing.
It's a tripwire.
Oh my God.
Got an explosion.
How many police did we just lose?
In the quiet rhythm of island life, violence is never expected to arrive with clarity. It does not announce itself in advance, and it does not always leave behind answers that feel complete. In Maui, where the ocean defines the horizon and communities are often tightly interwoven, even small disruptions echo further than they would in larger, more anonymous places. And in 2010, one such disruption would begin with a case that slowly shifted from confusion into something far more permanent in the memory of those who lived through it. The case of Makani Ray Dickerson would become one of those rare moments where a community is forced to confront not only a tragedy, but also the fragile structure of familiarity that once made everything feel safe. At the center of this case was a young individual, Makani Ray Dickerson, whose life was still in its formative stage at the time of the incident. There are cases where a person's history becomes the dominant lens through which events are understood, but here, what stands out most is not a long public record or a widely documented past, but rather the abrupt interruption of youth itself. The available information places emphasis on the fact that this was a young life caught within a moment of violence that would soon ripple far beyond the immediate participants. To understand how such an event could leave such a lasting imprint on Maui, one has to understand the environment in which it unfolded. Small communities operate differently from large cities. In places like Maui, people do not simply live near each other. They often live within overlapping social circles. Families know families. Students grow up seeing the same faces across schools, neighborhoods, and gatherings. This closeness creates a sense of belonging, but it also means that when something breaks, it does not remain isolated. It spreads through conversations, through silence, and through shared emotional weight. In this environment, privacy is not something easily maintained. Geography itself limits separation. Roads connect small clusters of life, and social familiarity often fills the gaps between formal relationships. When tensions arise within such a setting, they are rarely contained. They move through networks of friendship, family ties, and shared history. This is part of what made the eventual incident in 2010 so deeply unsettling for those who experienced it firsthand. Before the event itself occurred, there were already signs, though not necessarily signs that were recognized in real time as indicators of what was to come. The reconstruction of events later relied on witness statements and fragmented accounts, pieces of memory that were collected after the fact in an attempt to understand how a private confrontation could escalate into something irreversible. What emerges from these accounts is not a single, clear narrative of intent, but rather a sequence of interactions that gradually intensified until they reached a breaking point. Makani Ray Dickerson, as central to this case, is often discussed in terms of how quickly circumstances shifted around the incident. However, it is important to remain grounded in what the available information actually supports. The case does not present a neatly structured story of cause and effect. Instead, it presents a situation in which interpersonal conflict, once contained within private space, escalated into a fatal encounter. The exact motivations and emotional triggers remain part of what investigators later had to piece together through testimony and evidence. On the day the incident occurred in 2010, what began as a private confrontation did not remain private for long. At some point during that interaction, the situation escalated beyond control and resulted in a fatal outcome. The precise sequence of actions became a central focus of the investigation that followed. Law enforcement officers arriving at the scene were confronted with the immediate necessity of preserving evidence while also attempting to understand the basic structure of what had happened. In such cases, the first hours are critical not only for forensic purposes but also for establishing the foundation of the entire investigative narrative. The scene itself became the starting point for a much larger effort to reconstruct time. Investigators documented physical evidence with careful attention, knowing that every detail could later contribute to understanding how the confrontation escalated. Alongside this physical documentation, witness accounts began to form a parallel layer of information. These accounts, however, were not always consistent in detail. Memory under emotional stress often produces fragments rather than complete sequences, and part of the investigative challenge was to align these fragments into a coherent timeline. As news of the incident began to spread through the local community, the emotional response was immediate. In Maui, where people are often connected through shared spaces and relationships, the shock of violent crime does not remain confined to those directly involved. It moves outward quickly, reaching schools, neighborhoods, and workplaces. In the days following the incident, conversations began to circulate, not always with clarity, but with a shared sense of disbelief. People tried to understand how something so sudden could occur within an environment that many had long associated with safety and familiarity. The emotional impact was intensified by the age of those involved. Violence involving young individuals carries a particular weight in any community, but in a place like Maui, where youth often grow up within overlapping social circles, the sense of proximity makes the event feel even closer. It is not an abstract case discussed in distant terms. It becomes something that feels embedded in the lived experience of the community itself. Law enforcement agencies responded with urgency, recognizing early that the case would require careful and thorough reconstruction. Detectives began by identifying all individuals who had any connection to the events leading up to the incident. This process involved tracing interactions, reviewing statements, and establishing a timeline that could account for movements and contact points. One of the central challenges was determining whether the escalation had been premeditated or spontaneous, a distinction that would later carry significant weight in legal proceedings. As investigators worked through these questions, Makani Ray Dickerson became a central focus of the case. This does not imply a predetermined conclusion, but rather reflects the structure of investigative process itself, where individuals connected to the critical moment of escalation are examined in detail. Behavioral patterns, prior interactions, and contextual relationships were all considered as part of the broader effort to understand how the situation developed. At the same time, the emotional environment surrounding the investigation remained intense. Witnesses were not simply sources of information. They were individuals processing a traumatic event. Their statements, while essential to the reconstruction of events, were shaped by shock, confusion, and emotional strain. This added complexity to the investigative process, requiring careful cross-referencing of accounts to identify consistent elements. What emerges at this early stage of the case is not yet a story of legal resolution, but rather a portrait of disruption. A community accustomed to familiarity was confronted with uncertainty. A sequence of interactions that may have seemed ordinary in isolation became, in hindsight, the foundation of a tragic outcome. And at the center of it all was a young individual whose life became permanently associated with a moment that the community would struggle to fully comprehend. This is where the case of Makani Ray Dickerson begins, not with answers, but with questions that would take months to unravel. The incident itself would eventually move into the formal structures of investigation, courtroom procedure, and legal interpretation. But before all of that, there was simply a moment in time in Maui when something broke the expected rhythm of life, and nothing in the days that followed would feel quite the same again. The moment the situation escalated in 2010, it marked a transition that would permanently define the trajectory of the case. What had begun as a private confrontation between young individuals in Maui did not remain contained within that private space. Instead, it shifted rapidly into an irreversible act of violence, transforming an interpersonal conflict into a criminal investigation that would soon involve law enforcement, forensic teams, and an entire community struggling to understand what had just occurred. According to the reconstructed timeline built by investigators, the escalation did not occur in isolation from context. It was the culmination of prior tensions and interactions that had already been developing in the background. However, what remains consistently emphasized in official accounts is the suddenness of the shift from confrontation to fatal outcome. This sudden transition became one of the central challenges for investigators, because understanding how and why that threshold was crossed required piecing together fragmented human memory, physical evidence, and behavioral context. When law enforcement first arrived at the scene, they were met with the immediate reality that the situation had already reached its conclusion. At that point, the focus shifted entirely to preservation of evidence and reconstruction of events. Officers secured the area, ensuring that no further contamination of physical evidence would occur. This initial stage is critical in any homicide investigation, as the integrity of the scene determines the reliability of everything that follows. Inside that controlled perimeter, investigators began the slow process of documentation. Every detail was recorded with precision, not because each detail was immediately meaningful, but because the meaning often emerges later when pieces are connected. Objects, positions, environmental conditions, and physical traces were all carefully noted. In cases like this, where the emotional weight is already high, the discipline of procedure becomes essential to maintaining clarity. At the same time, attention turned outward toward the people who had been present before and during the incident. Witnesses became one of the primary sources of early information, though their accounts were naturally shaped by shock and emotional disruption. Some described only fragments of what they had seen or heard. Others struggled to place events in correct sequence. This is a common challenge in sudden violent incidents, where human memory is not a perfect recorder, but rather a reactive system influenced by stress and trauma. The process of gathering these statements began immediately, but investigators understood that early accounts often evolve over time. As individuals process traumatic experiences, details can shift, sharpen, or even become clearer days later. For this reason, initial interviews were treated as foundational but not definitive. They served as starting points for a broader investigative framework that would later be refined through corroboration and cross-referencing. As news of the incident spread through Maui, the community response was immediate and deeply emotional. In a place where social connections are tightly woven, information travels quickly, but so does uncertainty. People began gathering fragments of what had happened, often without complete clarity, and attempting to make sense of an event that defied easy explanation. Schools, neighborhoods, and workplaces became informal spaces of discussion, where individuals tried to reconcile the sudden presence of violence with their previous sense of stability. The emotional shock was intensified by the age of those involved. The fact that young individuals were at the center of the case made the event feel closer, more personal, and more destabilizing for the community. Violence is always disruptive, but when it occurs among youth, it challenges assumptions about development, environment, and the pathways that lead to such outcomes. These questions began to surface almost immediately in public conversation, even before formal legal proceedings had begun. Law enforcement, meanwhile, moved quickly to establish structure within the growing complexity of information. Detectives began mapping relationships between individuals connected to the incident. This involved identifying who had interacted with whom in the hours and days leading up to the confrontation and determining how those interactions might have influenced the escalation. The goal was not only to reconstruct events, but also to understand whether the outcome had been spontaneous or the result of escalating tension over time. One of the key challenges during this phase was distinguishing between perception and fact. In emotionally charged environments, Witnesses may interpret events differently based on proximity, emotional involvement, or partial visibility of what occurred. Investigators had to carefully separate subjective interpretation from observable detail. This required repeated interviews, comparison of statements, and alignment with physical evidence collected at the scene. As Makani Ray Dickerson became a central figure in the investigation, the focus expanded to include a broader examination of behavioral context. This did not imply a predetermined narrative of guilt, but rather reflected standard investigative procedure in which all individuals directly connected to a critical incident are examined in detail. Investigators looked at patterns of interaction, prior conflicts, and any available contextual information that could help explain the dynamics leading up to the confrontation. At the same time, forensic analysis played a crucial role in shaping the investigative direction. Physical evidence collected from the scene provided an objective counterbalance to the variability of witness testimony. This evidence helped establish a more stable timeline of events, allowing investigators to narrow down the sequence of actions that occurred during the critical moments of escalation. While forensic results do not always provide complete answers on their own, they are essential in anchoring the broader narrative of a case. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that the central question was not simply what happened, but how a dispute between young individuals could escalate so rapidly into a fatal outcome. This question guided much of the early investigative focus and would later become a central theme in legal proceedings. The distinction between impulsive action and deliberate intent emerged as a critical factor, shaping how the case would ultimately be interpreted within the justice system. During this period, the emotional atmosphere in Maui continued to intensify. Community members expressed grief, confusion, and a growing need for understanding. Informal gatherings and moments of reflection became part of the public response as people sought ways to process the event collectively. The interconnected nature of the community meant that many individuals felt some degree of proximity to the case, even if they were not directly involved. Law enforcement officials also had to manage the balance between investigative work and public communication. While the priority remained on gathering accurate information, there was also recognition that the community needed reassurance that the situation was being addressed thoroughly. However, due to the complexity of the investigation, much of the detailed information remained within the investigative process during this stage. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock began to give way to a more structured investigation. Patterns began to emerge from the collected data. Witness statements were refined. Forensic analysis provided clearer boundaries around what was physically possible. And investigators gradually built a working timeline that connected the private confrontation to the fatal outcome. Throughout this process, Makani Ray Dickerson remained a central point of reference within the case file, not as a conclusion, but as part of the investigative structure that sought to understand all individuals involved. The focus was consistently on reconstructing events rather than assigning meaning prematurely. This careful approach is essential in serious criminal investigations, where accuracy must take precedence over assumption. By the time the early investigative phase began to stabilize, the case had already shifted from a localized incident into a structured legal matter. What had occurred in a private setting in Maui had now entered the formal systems of forensic analysis, witness testimony, and judicial preparation. The foundation was being laid for the next stage of the process, where evidence would be tested in a courtroom environment and interpretations would be challenged through legal argument. At this stage, however, the most defining characteristic of the case remained uncertainty. Not uncertainty about whether a tragedy had occurred, but uncertainty about the precise chain of events that led to it. That uncertainty would become the driving force behind the investigation moving forward, shaping every subsequent step in the search for clarity. As the investigation into the 2010 Maui incident moved beyond its initial phase, the process began to shift from rapid response into deliberate reconstruction. The urgency that defined the first hours did not disappear, but it transformed into a more structured and methodical effort to connect fragments of information into a coherent sequence. At this stage, the case no longer revolved solely around the immediate shock of a fatal encounter. Instead, it became an exercise in interpretation, where every detail had to be examined not only for what it revealed on its own, but for how it aligned with everything else that had been collected. Detectives returned repeatedly to the central question that had emerged early in the case. How did a private confrontation escalate into lethal violence within such a short span of time? This question guided their approach as they reviewed witness statements, analyzed physical evidence, and compared different versions of events. It was not enough to know that an escalation had occurred. The investigative goal was to understand the sequence of decisions, actions, and reactions that transformed a conflict into a fatal outcome. Witness testimony continued to play a critical role during this phase, but also presented ongoing challenges. Individuals who had been present or nearby during the incident provided accounts that were often partial or shaped by their own perspective. Some described moments leading up to the confrontation, while others recalled only the aftermath. Investigators worked to align these accounts, identifying points of overlap and areas of inconsistency. Each statement was treated as one piece of a larger puzzle, rather than a definitive explanation on its own. Over time, patterns began to emerge from these overlapping accounts. While no single witness could provide a complete narrative, the combination of perspectives allowed investigators to approximate the flow of events. This process required careful attention to detail, as even small discrepancies could influence how the timeline was constructed. Investigators cross-referenced statements with physical evidence from the scene, using forensic findings to confirm or challenge specific elements of witness testimony. Forensic analysis became increasingly important as the investigation progressed. The physical evidence collected during the initial response was examined in greater depth, providing a more stable foundation for understanding the incident. While witness accounts could shift over time, physical evidence remained constant, offering an objective reference point. Investigators used this evidence to establish boundaries within which the sequence of events must have occurred. This helped narrow down possibilities and reduce uncertainty in key areas of the timeline. At the same time, detectives expanded their focus beyond the immediate moment of the incident to include the broader context in which it occurred. They examined interactions between individuals in the days leading up to the confrontation, looking for signs of escalating tension or unresolved conflict. This aspect of the investigation did not rely on speculation, but rather on documented interactions and statement from those who had observed or participated in those interactions. The goal was to determine whether the fatal encounter had been preceded by a pattern of conflict or whether it had emerged suddenly without clear warning. Makani Ray Dickerson remained a central figure within this expanding framework of analysis. Investigators examined all available information related to involvement in the incident, including behavioral context and prior interactions. This examination was conducted within the standard procedures of criminal investigation, where individuals directly connected to a critical event are evaluated in detail. The focus was not on forming conclusions prematurely, but on ensuring that all relevant information was considered before the case moved into the legal phase. One of the most complex aspects of this stage was the interpretation of intent. In cases involving sudden violence, determining intent requires more than identifying actions. It involves understanding the conditions under which those actions occurred. Investigators had to consider whether the escalation reflected a spontaneous reaction within a heated confrontation or whether it indicated a more deliberate progression toward a fatal outcome. This distinction would later become central in legal proceedings, but at this stage it remained an open question guiding investigative analysis. As the investigative process continued, the volume of information grew significantly. Reports, statements, and forensic findings were compiled into a structured case file. Detectives worked to organize this material in a way that would allow for clear presentation in court. This required not only accuracy, but also coherence. The narrative constructed from the evidence needed to reflect both the sequence of events and the reasoning behind investigative conclusions. During this period, communication between law enforcement and prosecutors became more frequent. While detectives focused on gathering and analyzing evidence, prosecutors began evaluating how that evidence could be presented within a legal framework. This collaboration ensured that the investigative process aligned with the requirements of the courtroom, where evidence must meet specific standards of admissibility and relevance. The transition from investigation to prosecution is a critical phase in any case, and it requires careful coordination between these two roles. The community in Maui continued to experience the emotional impact of the case as the investigation unfolded. Although the initial shock had begun to settle into a more sustained sense of reflection, the presence of the case remained strong in public awareness. Discussions shifted from immediate reaction to deeper questions about how such an event could occur. People sought to understand not only what had happened, but what factors might have contributed to the escalation. These conversations reflected a broader attempt to make sense of a tragedy that had disrupted the perceived stability of the community. Media coverage during this stage focused on developments within the investigation, though detailed information remained limited due to the ongoing nature of the case. Reports emphasized the complexity of the situation and the careful approach being taken by law enforcement. This coverage played a role in shaping public perception, reinforcing the idea that the case was not straightforward, but rather one that required thorough examination of multiple layers of evidence. As investigators refined their timeline, they reached a point where the sequence of events, while not perfectly complete, had become sufficiently defined to support legal action. The combination of witness testimony, forensic evidence, and contextual analysis provided a framework that could be presented in court. This marked a transition in the case, from investigation toward formal legal proceedings. The preparation for this transition involved detailed review of all collected material. Detectives revisited key pieces of evidence, ensuring that they had been properly documented and analyzed. Witnesses were re-interviewed where necessary to clarify details or address inconsistencies. Forensic findings were reviewed to confirm their interpretation and relevance. This process was essential in strengthening the integrity of the case before it entered the courtroom. At the same time, legal strategy began to take shape. Prosecutors evaluated how best to present the evidence in a way that would clearly convey the sequence of events and the reasoning behind the charges. They considered how to address potential challenges from the defense, including questions about witness reliability and the interpretation of intent. The goal was to construct a narrative that was both accurate and persuasive within the framework of the law. For the defense, preparation involved a different kind of analysis. Rather than constructing a single narrative, the focus was on examining the prosecution's case for weaknesses. This included questioning the consistency of witness statements, exploring alternative interpretations of the evidence, and emphasizing areas of uncertainty. In cases like this, where intent is a central issue, the defense often seeks to highlight ambiguity, arguing that the available evidence does not support a definitive conclusion about the nature of the actions involved. As these preparations progressed, the case moved steadily toward the courtroom. What had begun as a sudden and disorienting event in Maui was now entering a phase defined by structured legal process. The investigation had transformed fragments of memory and physical evidence into a framework that could be examined, challenged, and interpreted within a formal setting. Yet even at this stage, one element remained unchanged: the underlying uncertainty about how exactly a moment of conflict had crossed the threshold into irreversible violence. While the investigation had narrowed the possibilities and clarified many aspects of the timeline, it could not eliminate every question. These remaining uncertainties would become part of the legal process itself, shaping how arguments were presented and how decisions were ultimately made. As the courtroom phase approached, the case of Makani Ray Dickerson stood at a critical point. The investigative work had laid the foundation, but the task of interpretation was about to shift from detectives to a legal audience. Evidence would be examined under scrutiny, narratives would be tested through argument, and the question of intent would move from investigative analysis into judicial determination. The next stage would not only seek to establish accountability, but also to define how the events of that day would be understood within the framework of law. As the case moved fully into the courtroom phase, the atmosphere surrounding the proceedings shifted from investigative uncertainty to structured confrontation. What had once been a collection of fragmented accounts and forensic observations was now organized into competing narratives, each shaped by legal strategy and bound by procedural rules. In Maui, the courtroom became the central space where the meaning of the incident would be contested, examined, and ultimately defined within the framework of the law. From the outset, the presence of both families underscored the human weight of the proceedings. On one side, the loss of a young life remained the unspoken center of every argument presented. On the other, the reality that another young individual stood accused of causing that loss introduced a parallel dimension of consequence. The courtroom did not separate these realities. It placed them in direct proximity, creating an environment where grief and accountability coexisted in a way that was both visible and deeply felt. The prosecution approached the case with a focus on clarity and sequence. Their objective was to present a coherent reconstruction of events that would demonstrate how the private confrontation escalated into a fatal outcome. This required careful presentation of the timeline established during the investigation. Witness testimony was introduced to outline the progression of interactions, while forensic evidence provided an anchor for the physical realities of the incident. Together, these elements were intended to form a narrative that could be understood as both logical and supported by the available evidence. Witnesses who took the stand during the trial did so under conditions that were markedly different from the initial investigative interviews. In the courtroom, their statements were subject to direct examination and cross-examination, processes designed to test consistency, credibility, and interpretation. Some witnesses described their recollection of events leading up to the confrontation, while others focused on what they observed during or immediately after the incident. Each account contributed to the overall structure of the prosecution's case, but each was also subject to scrutiny. The defense approached these testimonies with a focus on identifying inconsistencies and highlighting areas of uncertainty. In cases where events unfold rapidly and under emotional stress, discrepancies between witness accounts are not uncommon. The defense emphasized these discrepancies, arguing that variations in recollection could affect the reliability of the overall narrative. By doing so, they sought to introduce doubt regarding the precision of the timeline and the interpretation of specific actions. Forensic evidence, presented through expert testimony, played a crucial role in grounding the case in objective analysis. Experts explained how physical findings from the scene aligned with or contradicted elements of the witness accounts. This evidence was not presented in isolation, but was integrated into the broader narrative constructed by the prosecution. Its purpose was to provide a stable reference point within a case otherwise shaped by human perception and memory. At the center of the legal arguments was the question of intent. The prosecution aimed to demonstrate that the sequence of actions leading to the fatal outcome reflected a level of responsibility consistent with criminal liability. They framed the escalation as a progression that could not be dismissed as purely accidental or beyond control. In contrast, the defense focused on the complexity of the situation, arguing that the available evidence did not conclusively establish a deliberate intention to cause a fatal result. This distinction between impulsive reaction and deliberate action became the focal point of the trial. As the proceedings continued, the courtroom environment remained charged with emotional intensity. Family members listened to testimony that revisited the events in detail, often reliving aspects of the incident through the words of witnesses and experts. The formal structure of the trial provided order, but it did not diminish the emotional impact of the material being presented. Each piece of evidence carried both legal significance and personal resonance. Media coverage during the trial extended the reach of the proceedings beyond the courtroom. Reports summarized key developments, highlighting the arguments presented by both sides and the evidence introduced during testimony. For the broader community in Maui and across Hawaii, these reports became the primary means of following the case. The coverage contributed to ongoing public discussion, with individuals forming perspectives based on the information available through these channels. As closing arguments approached, both sides focused on consolidating their positions. The prosecution revisited the timeline, emphasizing the coherence of the sequence they had presented and the alignment between witness testimony and forensic evidence. They argued that the combination of these elements supported a clear conclusion regarding responsibility. The defense, meanwhile, reinforced their emphasis on uncertainty, pointing to areas where the evidence could be interpreted in multiple ways and arguing that these uncertainties should weigh against a definitive finding of intent. The responsibility for interpreting these arguments ultimately rested with the court. The decision-making process required careful evaluation of all evidence presented, as well as consideration of the legal standards that define criminal responsibility. This process is inherently structured, but it also involves interpretation, particularly in cases where intent is not directly observable, but must be inferred from actions and context. When the verdict was delivered, it marked a significant turning point in the case. For the legal system, it represented the conclusion of the trial phase and the application of law to the facts as presented. For those directly affected, however, the meaning of the verdict extended beyond its legal definition. For some, it provided a sense of closure, a formal acknowledgement of responsibility within the framework of justice. For others, it left unresolved questions about the circumstances that led to the incident and whether the outcome fully addressed those complexities. Following the verdict, the case moved into the sentencing phase, where the court evaluated factors relevant to determining the appropriate legal consequences. These factors included the nature of the actions involved, the context in which they occurred, and considerations related to intent and responsibility. Sentencing decisions are guided by legal standards, but they also reflect the broader principles of justice within the system. During this phase, both prosecution and defense had the opportunity to present arguments regarding the appropriate outcome. The prosecution emphasized the severity of the incident and its impact, while the defense focused on contextual elements that they argued should influence the final decision. The court's role was to weigh these perspectives within the boundaries of the law, ensuring that the final judgment reflected both the specifics of the case and the standards applied to similar situations. As the sentencing decision was finalized, the legal process reached a form of completion. The structured progression from investigation to trial to judgment had followed its course, resulting in an outcome defined by the judicial system. Yet, as with many cases involving young individuals and sudden violence, the conclusion of legal proceedings did not equate to a complete resolution of all questions. For the community in Maui, the end of the trial marked a transition from active attention to reflective memory. The case remained present in conversations, not as a developing event, but as a reference point for understanding the vulnerabilities within the social environment. Discussions about youth, conflict, and prevention continued, shaped in part by the awareness that such an incident had occurred within their own community. For the families involved, the conclusion of the legal process represented a different kind of transition. The formal proceedings had provided structure and, to some extent, answers, but they could not fully address the emotional impact of the loss and the circumstances surrounding it. The courtroom had defined responsibility within the law, but the personal consequences extended beyond that definition. In the broader context, the case of Makani Ray Dickerson came to represent more than a single incident. It became an example of how quickly circumstances can shift, how complex the interpretation of human behavior can be, and how the legal system seeks to impose clarity on events that are often shaped by uncertainty. The trial had provided a framework for understanding, but it had also revealed the limits of that framework. As the courtroom emptied and the formal proceedings concluded, what remained was not only a legal outcome, but also a lasting imprint on the community. The case had moved through every stage of the justice system, from initial response to final judgment, leaving behind a narrative that would continue to be remembered, discussed, and reflected upon. In the period following the conclusion of the courtroom proceedings, the case of Makani Ray Dickerson did not simply fade into the background of Maui's daily life. Instead, it entered a different phase, one defined less by active legal debate and more by reflection, consequence, and a long shadow that such an event casts over a close-knit community. The formal structures of the justice system had completed their role, but the broader impact of the case continued to unfold in ways that were less visible, yet no less significant. For many in Maui, the immediate sense of urgency that had surrounded the investigation and trial gradually gave way to a quieter, more enduring form of awareness. The case became part of the collective memory of the community, a reference point that people returned to when discussing issues of youth, conflict, and a fragile balance that exists within small social networks. Unlike larger cities, where events can be absorbed into a constant flow of new information, Maui's scale allowed this case to remain present in a more persistent way. It was not just a headline from the past. It was something that had happened within a shared environment, among people who were connected through everyday life. The emotional consequences for the families involved remained central to the aftermath. For the family of the victim, the conclusion of the legal process did not bring a resolution in the deeper sense of the word. The courtroom had provided answers within the boundaries of law, but could not restore what had been lost. The absence created by the event continued to define their experience, shaping how they moved forward in the years that followed. Grief, in such cases, does not follow a clear timeline. It persists, evolving over time, but never fully disappearing. For the family of Makani Ray Dickerson, the aftermath carried a different but equally complex weight. The outcome of the case placed their name within a public narrative that extended far beyond the courtroom. They faced the challenge of navigating life in a community where the case remained widely known, and where the boundaries between public perception and private experience were often blurred. This aspect of the aftermath highlights a broader reality of criminal cases in small communities, where the impact is rarely confined to a single individual and instead spreads across interconnected relationships. Within the educational and social institutions of Maui, the case prompted a period of reflection that extended beyond individual reactions. Schools, in particular, became spaces where discussions about conflict and behavior took on renewed importance. Educators and administrators recognized that the incident had affected not only those directly involved, but also students who had followed the case and struggled to process its implications. Conversations about how disagreements are managed, how emotions are expressed, and how support systems can be strengthened became more prominent in the wake of the event. Community organizations also responded by emphasizing prevention and awareness. While the legal process had addressed accountability after the fact, there was a growing recognition that similar incidents could only be prevented through earlier intervention. Programs focused on conflict resolution, youth engagement, and communication skills began to receive increased attention. These efforts were not framed as direct responses to a single case, but the influence of the Makani Ray Dickerson incident was evident in the urgency with which these topics were approached. At a broader level, the case contributed to ongoing discussions about youth violence and the factors that contribute to its emergence. In Hawaii, as in many places, such discussions often involve a combination of social, psychological, and environmental considerations. The case did not provide definitive answers to these questions, but it served as a concrete example that could be referenced when examining how tensions develop and how they can escalate under certain conditions. This role as a reference point ensured that the case remained relevant in conversations long after the legal proceedings had ended. Media coverage, which had been intense during the trial, gradually diminished over time. However, the case did not disappear entirely from public discourse. It continued to be mentioned in retrospectives, analyses, and discussions about similar incidents. The narrative that had been constructed during the investigation and trial became part of a larger body of cases used to understand patterns and challenges within the justice system. In this way, The case extended beyond its immediate context and contributed to a broader understanding of how such events are investigated and adjudicated. One of the enduring aspects of the case was the way it highlighted the complexity of interpreting human behavior. The distinction between impulsive action and deliberate intent, which had been central to the trial, remained a point of reflection even after the verdict. For many observers, this distinction raised questions about how individuals respond under pressure and how quickly situations can shift beyond control. These questions do not have simple answers, and the case illustrated the difficulty of applying clear categories to events that are shaped by emotion, context, and rapid escalation. The legal system, for its part, had fulfilled its function by providing a structured process through which evidence was examined and conclusions were reached. Yet the case also demonstrated the limits of that system. While it can determine responsibility and impose consequences, it cannot fully capture the complexity of human experience or provide complete closure for those affected. This gap between legal resolution and emotional reality is a recurring theme in cases of this nature, and it was evident in the aftermath of the Makani Ray Dickerson case. In Maui, the memory of the incident gradually became integrated into the broader narrative of the community's history. It was not constantly revisited, but neither was it forgotten. Instead, it existed as a point of reference, something that could be recalled when discussing the vulnerabilities that exist even within close and familiar environments. This form of memory is quieter than the initial shock, but it is also more enduring, shaping perceptions and attitudes over time. For individuals who had been indirectly affected by the case, the passage of time brought a gradual return to normalcy, but with a heightened awareness of how quickly circumstances can change. The event served as a reminder that conflict, when left unchecked, can escalate in unpredictable ways. This awareness influenced how people approached interactions, particularly among younger members of the community, where the lessons drawn from the case were most directly applied. The case also underscored the importance of communication and support within communities. In environments where relationships are closely interconnected, the ability to address tensions early can play a critical role in preventing escalation. While the case itself could not be undone, it contributed to a broader understanding of how such prevention might be approached in the future. This shift in perspective, though gradual, represented one of the more constructive outcomes to emerge from the tragedy. As years passed, the immediate intensity of the case diminished, but its significance remained. It continued to be referenced not because of its uniqueness, but because of how clearly it illustrated a set of challenges that are present in many communities. The intersection of youth, conflict, and rapid escalation is not limited to any single location, but the Makani Ray Dickerson case provided a specific example through which these issues could be examined. In the end, the aftermath of the case was defined not by a single outcome, but by a range of ongoing effects that extended across individuals, institutions, and the community as a whole. The legal process had provided structure and resolution within its own framework, but the broader impact of the case continued to unfold in ways that were less formal but equally important. It shaped conversations, influenced perspectives, and left a lasting imprint on the collective understanding of how quickly ordinary circumstances can change. The story did not conclude with a final decision in the courtroom. Instead, it continued in the lives of those who carried its memory, in the systems that adapted in response to it, and in the ongoing effort to understand what it revealed about human behavior and community dynamics. In this sense, the Makani Ray Dickerson case remains not only a record of a specific event, but also a reflection of the challenges that arise when moments of conflict cross into irreversible consequences, leaving behind questions that extend far beyond the boundaries of any single case. In the years that followed the legal conclusion of the Makani Ray Dickerson case, the story did not settle into silence, so much as it transformed into something quieter, more internal, and more enduring. The visible structures of the case, the investigation, the courtroom, the verdict, had all reached their defined endpoints. What remained was less structured, less formal, but deeply embedded in the lives of those who had witnessed the unfolding of events in Maui. The aftermath became a process of integration, where a community that had once been shaken by sudden violence began to absorb that reality into its long-term understanding of itself. Time, in cases like this, does not erase what has happened. Instead, it changes the way it is remembered. In the immediate aftermath, the case had been a source of shock and urgency. Conversations were immediate, emotions were raw, and the need for understanding felt pressing. As time passed, those same conversations became more reflective. The urgency softened, but the questions remained. People no longer asked only what had happened, but why it had happened and what could be learned from it. For the community in Maui, this shift in perspective marked an important transition. The case of Makani Ray Dickerson was no longer an active event, but it was not a closed chapter either. It existed in a space between memory and meaning, where individuals and institutions continued to interpret its significance. In schools, among families, and within local organizations, the case was occasionally referenced not for its details, but for what it represented. It became a symbol of how quickly ordinary interactions can change, and how the consequences of those changes can extend far beyond the moment itself. The emotional impact on the families involved remained one of the most enduring aspects of the case. For the family of the victim, the passage of time did not diminish the reality of loss. Instead, it altered its form. Grief moved from the immediate intensity of the early days into a more sustained presence, one that shaped daily life in quieter but persistent ways. The absence left by the event continued to influence how they experienced the world, creating a lasting connection between past and present. For the family of Makani Ray Dickerson, the long-term consequences were shaped by a different set of challenges. The case had placed them within a narrative that extended beyond their private lives, and that narrative did not simply disappear with the conclusion of legal proceedings. Living within a community where the case was known meant navigating a complex landscape of perception and identity. Over time, this required adaptation, resilience, and the ongoing effort to move forward while carrying the weight of what had occurred. At a broader level, the case contributed to a gradual shift in how the community approached issues related to youth and conflict. While no single event can define an entire system, the Makani Ray Dickerson case became one of several moments that prompted reflection on how early signs of tension might be recognized and addressed. This reflection did not result in immediate or uniform change, but it influenced conversations about prevention, communication, and support. Community programs that focused on conflict resolution and emotional awareness gained increased attention in the years following the case. These efforts were not framed as direct responses to a single incident, but the influence of that incident was evident in the way these programs were discussed and implemented. There was a growing recognition that preventing escalation requires more than reacting to visible conflict. It requires creating environments where individuals have the tools to manage tension before it reaches a critical point. Within the educational system, similar themes began to emerge. Schools became spaces where discussions about behavior, responsibility, and emotional regulation were integrated into broader conversations about student development. Educators understood that students were not only aware of the case, but were also affected by its implications. Addressing those implications required creating opportunities for dialogue, reflection, and support. The case also left an imprint on how law enforcement and legal professionals in the region approached similar situations. While the procedures themselves did not fundamentally change, the experience of the case contributed to an evolving understanding of the complexities involved in incidents where young individuals are at the center. This understanding influenced how future cases were approached, particularly in terms of communication with the community and the careful handling of sensitive information. As the years continued to pass, the case gradually became part of the broader narrative of Maui's history. It was no longer at the forefront of public attention, but remained present as a reference point. People who had lived through the events carried their own memories, while those who learned about the case later encountered it as part of a larger conversation about community, responsibility, and the nature of conflict. One of the enduring lessons of the case lies in its illustration of how quickly circumstances can shift. The transition from a private confrontation to a fatal outcome occurred within a limited span of time, yet its consequences extended across years and into multiple dimensions of life. This contrast between the brevity of the incident and the longevity of its impact is a defining characteristic of many cases involving sudden violence, and it was particularly evident here. Another important aspect is the way the case highlights the limitations of certainty. Despite thorough investigation and legal proceedings, some questions remained unresolved in the minds of those who followed the case. These questions were not necessarily about the legal outcome, but about the deeper understanding of how and why the escalation occurred. The persistence of these questions reflects the inherent complexity of human behavior, especially in situations shaped by emotion and rapid decision-making. For the community, learning to live with these uncertainties became part of the long-term process of adaptation. Rather than seeking complete answers, there is a gradual shift toward acknowledging that not all aspects of such events can be fully explained. This acknowledgement does not diminish the importance of the case, but it reframes it as part of a broader reality in which some elements of human experience remain difficult to define. In reflecting on the Makani Ray Dickerson case, it becomes clear that its significance extends beyond the specifics of the incident itself. It serves as a reminder of the interconnected nature of communities, where the actions of individuals can have far-reaching effects. It also underscores the importance of understanding conflict not as an isolated event, but as a process that develops over time and can, under certain conditions, escalate in unexpected ways. The story, as it exists now, is not one of resolution in the traditional sense. The legal system has completed its role, and the formal narrative has been established. Yet the emotional and social dimensions of the case continue to evolve, shaped by memory, reflection, and the passage of time. This ongoing evolution is part of what gives the case its lasting relevance, ensuring that it remains part of the conversation even as new events emerge. Ultimately, the legacy of the case is defined by its impact on how people think about safety, responsibility, and the nature of human interaction. It does not offer simple conclusions or clear lessons that can be applied universally. Instead, it presents a complex picture of how ordinary circumstances can shift, how communities respond to disruption, and how the search for understanding continues long after the formal processes have ended. As the story of Makani Ray Dickerson settles into its place within the broader context of Maui's history, it leaves behind a quiet but persistent presence. It is remembered not only for what happened, but for what it revealed about the fragility of stability and the importance of awareness in the moments before conflict becomes irreversible. And in that sense, it continues to speak, not through headlines or courtroom arguments, but through the ongoing reflection of those who carry its memory forward. As time continued to move forward, the case of Makani Ray Dickerson gradually shifted from an active memory into something more deeply embedded within the cultural and emotional fabric of Maui. It was no longer discussed with the immediacy that had once defined it, yet it had not disappeared. Instead, it existed in a quieter form, resurfacing at moments when conversations turned toward questions of youth, conflict, and the unpredictability of human behavior. In this way, the case became less about a single event and more about what that event revealed, and how those revelations continued to influence the way people understood their environment. One of the most significant long-term effects of the case was the way it altered perception. Before the incident, many within the community had operated under an implicit assumption that serious violence was something that happened elsewhere, in larger cities or under more extreme circumstances. The events of 2010 disrupted that assumption. They demonstrated that even within a setting defined by familiarity and close social ties, the conditions for escalation could exist. This realization did not create constant fear, but it did introduce a new layer of awareness, one that remained present even as daily life returned to its usual rhythm. This shift in awareness influenced how individuals interpreted interactions, particularly among younger members of the community. Situations that might previously have been dismissed as minor disagreements were now viewed through a more cautious lens. The understanding that conflict can evolve in unpredictable ways encouraged a more deliberate approach to communication and resolution. While these changes were not always visible, they represented an internal adjustment in how people process tension and risk. In educational settings, the legacy of the case continued to inform discussions about behavior and responsibility. Students who had been too young to fully understand the case at the time of its occurrence later encountered it as part of broader conversations about decision-making and consequence. Teachers and counselors incorporated these themes into their work, not by revisiting the details of the incident, but by emphasizing the principles that could be drawn from it. The goal was not to create fear, but to foster awareness and provide tools for managing conflict in constructive ways. Community organizations also maintained a focus on prevention, building on the momentum that had developed in the years immediately following the case. Programs designed to support youth, encourage open communication, and address emotional challenges remained active, reflecting a sustained commitment to reducing the likelihood of similar incidents. These efforts were shaped by a recognition that prevention is an ongoing process rather than a one-time response, requiring consistent attention and adaptation over time. For those who had been directly connected to the case, the passage of time brought a different kind of evolution. The intensity of the initial experience gradually gave way to a more stable, though still complex, form of memory. Individuals who had been involved as witnesses, community members, or observers carried their own perspectives, shaped by their proximity to the event and their role within it. These perspectives did not always align, but together they formed a collective understanding that was richer and more nuanced than any single narrative. The families at the center of the case continued to navigate the long-term impact in ways that were deeply personal. For the family of the victim, the process of moving forward involved integrating the loss into their lives while maintaining a connection to the memory of what had been taken. This process is not linear, and it does not lead to a point where the past is simply left behind. Instead, it becomes part of an ongoing relationship with memory, one that changes over time but remains present. For the family of Makani Ray Dickerson, the long-term experience was shaped by the intersection of personal reality and public narrative. The case had created a lasting association between their name and the events of 2010, an association that could not be easily separated from their identity within the community. Over time, navigating this reality required finding ways to exist within a space where the past was known but not always openly discussed. This dynamic reflects a broader challenge faced by families connected to high-profile cases, particularly in smaller communities where anonymity is limited. Beyond the immediate community, the case also contributed to a wider understanding of youth-related violence within Hawaii. It became one of several cases referenced in discussions about how conflicts among young individuals can escalate and what factors might contribute to such escalation. These discussions often extended into academic, social, and policy contexts, where the case served as an example of the complexities involved in interpreting behavior and preventing harm. One of the enduring themes that emerged from these discussions was the importance of context. The case illustrated that actions cannot always be understood in isolation, but must be considered within the broader framework of relationships, environment, and emotional dynamics. This understanding influenced how similar cases were approached, encouraging a more comprehensive perspective that takes into account not only what happened, but the conditions under which it happened. At the same time, the case reinforced the idea that not all aspects of human behavior can be fully predicted or controlled. Despite efforts to identify patterns and implement preventive measures, there remains an element of unpredictability in how individuals respond to certain situations. Acknowledging this reality does not diminish the importance of prevention, but it does highlight the need for ongoing vigilance and adaptability. As the years passed, the memory of the case became less defined by its details and more by its impact. People did not necessarily recall every aspect of the investigation or trial, but they remembered how the event had felt, how it had disrupted their sense of normalcy, and how it had prompted reflection. This form of memory is less precise but more enduring, shaping attitudes and perspectives in subtle but meaningful ways. The physical spaces connected to the case also took on a different significance over time. Locations that had once been associated with the incident gradually returned to their ordinary functions. But for those who knew the history, they carried an additional layer of meaning. This duality is common in places where significant events have occurred, where everyday life continues alongside the quiet presence of memory. In the broader narrative of Maui, the Makani Ray Dickerson case became one chapter among many, but one that carried particular weight because of its circumstances. It was not defined by complexity alone, but by the way it intersected with fundamental aspects of community life. It touched on relationships, youth, trust, and the boundaries between ordinary conflict and irreversible consequence. Looking back, the case can be understood as both a specific event and a point of reference for larger themes. It demonstrates how quickly situations can change, how interconnected communities experience and process trauma, and how the search for understanding continues even after formal conclusions have been reached. These themes are not unique to this case, but they are clearly illustrated within it, making it a valuable point of reflection. In the end, the legacy of the Makani Ray Dickerson case is not defined solely by what happened in 2010, but by how that moment has continued to influence thought, conversation, and awareness in the years since. It remains present not as an ongoing event, but as a reminder, one that exists quietly within the collective memory of the community. And in that quiet presence, it continues to shape the way people understand the fragile balance between ordinary life and the moments that can change it forever. Over an even longer stretch of time, the story of the Makani Ray Dickerson case settled into something that no longer belonged solely to the past, but also to the way the community imagined its future. It became less about revisiting the incident itself and more about how its presence continued to shape attitudes, decisions, and quiet assumptions about safety, responsibility, and human behavior. The case was no longer an immediate point of reference in everyday conversation, yet remained embedded in the deeper layers of awareness that guide how individuals interpret the world around them. In Maui, where relationships often overlap and social circles are closely connected, memory functions differently than it does in larger, more anonymous places. Events are not easily compartmentalized or forgotten because they are tied to people, locations, and shared experiences. The Makani Ray Dickerson case became one of those events that linger not through constant discussion, but through a subtle, collective understanding. It existed in the background of interactions, influencing how people approach situations even when it was not explicitly mentioned. This kind of influence is difficult to measure, but it can be observed in small shifts in behavior and perspective. Individuals who had lived through the time of the case often carried a heightened awareness of how quickly circumstances can change. This awareness did not manifest as fear, but as caution and attentiveness. Conversations, especially those involving disagreement or tension, were approached with a greater sensitivity to how emotions can escalate. In this way, the case contributed to a gradual cultural adjustment, one that prioritized de-escalation and communication. Among younger generations, the transmission of this awareness took on a different form. Those who had not experienced the case directly learned about it indirectly through conversations, educational settings, or community discussions. For them, the case was not a memory, but a narrative, something that illustrated broader principles about behavior and consequence. The way this narrative was presented often focused less on the specifics of the incident and more on its implications, emphasizing the importance of understanding emotional responses and making deliberate choices in moments of conflict. Educational institutions continued to play a role in shaping this understanding. Programs that addressed emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, and interpersonal communication became part of a broader effort to equip students with the skills needed to navigate complex social situations. These programs were not solely a response to any single case, but the influence of past events like the Makani Ray Dickerson case could be seen in the emphasis placed on these topics. The goal was to create an environment where individuals could recognize early signs of tension and respond in ways that prevent escalation. At the same time, community organizations maintained a focus on creating spaces for dialogue and support. These efforts reflected a recognition that preventing violence requires more than individual awareness. It involves building networks of support where people feel comfortable expressing concerns, seeking help, and addressing issues before they intensify. The legacy of the case contributed to this understanding, reinforcing the idea that community resilience depends on both individual and collective action. For those who had been directly affected, the passage of time brought a different kind of continuity. The initial intensity of the experience gradually evolved into a more stable form of memory, but did not lose its significance. Instead, it became part of the ongoing narrative of their lives, influencing how they understood the past and how they approached the future. This process of integration is complex, shaped by personal reflection, relationships, and the passage of time. The families at the center of the case continued to navigate their own paths forward, each shaped by their unique experiences. Their stories did not end with the conclusion of legal proceedings, but continued in ways that were not always visible to the broader community. These individual journeys are an important part of the case's legacy, reminding us that the impact of such events extends far beyond what is recorded in official accounts. In the wider context of Hawaii, the case became one of many that contribute to an ongoing conversation about youth, conflict, and the conditions that lead to violence. It did not stand alone, but it held a particular place within this conversation because of the clarity with which it illustrated certain challenges. The sudden escalation from conflict to fatal outcome, the involvement of young individuals, and the impact on a close-knit community all made it a significant point of reference. These broader discussions often focused on identifying patterns and exploring ways to reduce risk. While no system can eliminate the possibility of violence entirely, the goal is to create conditions that make such outcomes less likely. The Makani Ray Dickerson case contributed to this effort by providing a concrete example of how quickly situations can change and how important it is to address underlying tensions before they reach a critical point. One of the more subtle aspects of the case's legacy is the way it influenced how people think about responsibility. In the immediate aftermath, responsibility is often framed in clear terms, defined by legal standards and outcomes. Over time, however, the concept becomes more nuanced, encompassing not only individual actions, but also the broader context in which those actions occur. This shift in perspective encourages a more comprehensive understanding of how responsibility is shared across individuals, relationships, and systems. The passage of time also brings a certain distance, allowing for reflection that is less shaped by immediate emotion. This distance does not diminish the seriousness of the case, but creates space for deeper consideration. People are able to look back and consider not only what happened, but how it was understood, how it was addressed, and what could be done differently in the future. This reflective process is an essential part of how communities learn and evolve. In Maui, this process of reflection has contributed to a gradual strengthening of awareness around issues that might otherwise remain unexamined. Conversations about mental health, communication, and conflict are more common and more open than they might have been in the past. While these changes cannot be attributed to any single event, the influence of cases like the Makani Ray Dickerson case is evident in the way these topics are approached. As the years continue to pass, the case becomes part of a larger historical narrative, one that includes both challenges and responses. It is remembered not only for the tragedy it represents, but for the way it prompted reflection and change. This dual aspect is important, as it highlights both the cost of the event and the potential for growth that can emerge from it. The story, in its current form, is no longer defined by a sequence of events, but by a set of meanings that have developed over time. It is a story about how a community responds to disruption, how individuals process loss and responsibility, and how understanding evolves in the face of complexity. These themes ensure that the case remains relevant, even as the specifics of the incident recede into the background. Ultimately, the enduring presence of the Makani Ray Dickerson case lies in its ability to prompt ongoing reflection. It does not offer simple lessons or definitive conclusions, but it encourages a continued awareness of how fragile stability can be and how important it is to approach conflict with care and understanding. In this way, it continues to influence the community not through direct action, but through the quiet persistence of memory and the insights that memory provides. And so, even as the details of the case become less immediate, its significance remains. It lives on in the way people think, in the way they interact, and in the way they approach the challenges of living within a shared environment. It is not a story that ends, but one that continues to unfold in subtle ways, shaping the present through the enduring presence of the past. As the passage of time continued to create distance between the present and the events of 2010, the Makani Ray Dickerson case took on a more contemplative role within the broader narrative of Maui's social history. It was no longer primarily a subject of discussion driven by immediacy or emotional intensity, but rather one that surfaced in quieter, more reflective contexts. In conversations about community resilience, youth development, and the nature of conflict, the case existed as a point of reference, a reminder of how quickly circumstances can change and how deeply those changes can resonate over time. This transformation from active memory to reflective reference did not diminish the importance of the case. Instead, it allowed for a deeper level of engagement with its implications. Without the urgency of ongoing legal proceedings or media coverage, individuals and institutions could consider the case with a broader perspective, examining not only the sequence of events, but also the underlying dynamics that contributed to its outcome. This shift in focus is a natural part of how communities process significant events, moving from reaction to analysis, from shock to understanding. One of the key elements that continued to shape this understanding was the recognition of how interconnected relationships influence the trajectory of conflict. In a place like Maui, where social networks are closely intertwined, interactions rarely occur in isolation. The case illustrated how tensions within these networks can develop over time, sometimes in ways that are not immediately visible. This awareness encouraged a more attentive approach to relationships, with an emphasis on communication and the early identification of potential issues. For those who had been part of the community during the time of the incident, the memory of the case served as a quiet but persistent influence on how they interpreted social dynamics. Situations that might once have been overlooked or minimized were now considered with greater care. This did not mean that conflict was avoided altogether, but it did mean that there was a heightened awareness of the need to address it constructively. In this way, the case contributed to a subtle but meaningful shift in how people engaged with one another. Among younger generations, the case functioned differently. Without direct experience of the events, their understanding was shaped by the way the story was communicated over time. This often involved a focus on broader themes rather than specific details, emphasizing the importance of decision-making, emotional awareness, and the potential consequences of escalation. Through educational programs and community discussions, these themes were integrated into a larger framework of learning, helping to prepare individuals to navigate complex social situations. Educational institutions played a significant role in this process, not only by providing information, but by creating spaces for dialogue. Students were encouraged to think critically about conflict, to consider multiple perspectives, and to develop strategies for managing tension. These efforts reflected a recognition that knowledge alone is not sufficient. It must be accompanied by the ability to apply that knowledge in real-world situations. The legacy of the Makani Ray Dickerson case contributed to this approach, reinforcing the importance of proactive engagement with issues that might otherwise remain unaddressed. At the same time, community organizations continued to build on the lessons that had emerged in the years following the case. Initiatives focused on youth support, mental health, and communication remained central to these efforts, reflecting a sustained commitment to creating a safer and more supportive environment. These initiatives were not static. They evolved over time, adapting to new challenges and incorporating new insights. The case remained one of many influences shaping this ongoing process. For the families involved, the long-term experience was characterized by a different kind of continuity. The passage of time did not erase the impact of the case, but allowed for a gradual process of adaptation. Memories became less immediate, but no less significant, forming part of a broader narrative that continued to influence their lives. This process is deeply personal and varies from one individual to another, but it is an essential aspect of how people move forward after significant events. The broader community, while not directly experiencing the same level of impact, also engaged in its own process of adaptation. The initial disruption caused by the case had long since settled, but the awareness it created remained. This awareness influenced how people thought about safety, responsibility, and the importance of maintaining strong social connections. It also contributed to a more nuanced understanding of how communities function, recognizing both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. In the context of Hawaii as a whole, the Makani Ray Dickerson case became part of a larger conversation about youth violence and its prevention. It was not an isolated example, but it held particular significance because of the way it encapsulated key challenges. The sudden escalation of conflict, the involvement of young individuals, and the impact on a close-knit community all made it a valuable case for examination and discussion. These discussions extended beyond Maui, contributing to a broader understanding of how similar issues might be addressed in other contexts. One of the enduring insights from the case is the importance of early intervention. While it is not always possible to predict or prevent every instance of conflict, there's a growing recognition that addressing issues at an early stage can reduce the likelihood of escalation. This insight has influenced both formal and informal approaches to conflict resolution, encouraging a more proactive stance that prioritizes communication and support. Another important aspect is the recognition of the role that environment plays in shaping behavior. The case highlighted how social dynamics, relationships, and situational factors can all contribute to the way individuals respond in moments of tension. Understanding these influences is essential for developing effective strategies for prevention, as it allows for a more comprehensive approach that goes beyond focusing solely on individual actions. As the case continues to be remembered and discussed, it serves as a reminder of the complexity of human behavior and the challenges of interpreting it. There are no simple explanations or solutions, and each case brings its own set of circumstances and variables. The Makani Ray Dickerson case, in particular, illustrates how multiple factors can intersect in ways that lead to unexpected and irreversible outcomes. In reflecting on the case, it is also important to consider the role of the justice system. While the legal process provides a structured framework for addressing responsibility, it is only one part of a larger process of understanding and response. The conclusions reached in court are essential, but they do not encompass the full range of questions and implications that arise from such events. This distinction underscores the need for a broader perspective that includes both legal and social dimensions. Over time, the case has become part of a collective narrative that continues to evolve. It is not fixed or static, but shaped by ongoing reflection and interpretation. Each generation encounters it in a slightly different way, influenced by their own experiences and the context in which they learn about it. This dynamic quality ensures that the case remains relevant, even as the specifics of the incident become less immediate. Ultimately, the Makani Ray Dickerson case stands as a reminder of the delicate balance that exists within communities. It highlights the importance of awareness, communication, and support in maintaining that balance, and it illustrates the consequences that can arise when it is disrupted. While the events of 2010 cannot be changed, the understanding that has developed in their aftermath continues to influence how people approach similar challenges. In this way, the case does not simply belong to the past. It continues to shape the present and inform the future, serving as a point of reflection and a source of insight. Its legacy is not defined by a single outcome or conclusion, but by the ongoing process of learning and adaptation that it has inspired. And within that process, it remains a quiet but enduring presence, a reminder of both the fragility and resilience of the communities in which we live. With the continued passage of time, the Makani Ray Dickerson case entered a stage where its presence was no longer defined by visibility, but by endurance. It remained embedded in the consciousness of the community in a way that did not require constant attention to be felt. Instead, it existed as a quiet reference point, something that shaped perception from beneath the surface, influencing how people thought about conflict, responsibility, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. In this stage, the case was no longer an event being processed, but a memory that had already been absorbed into the framework through which new experiences were interpreted. In Maui, where social connections are tightly woven and personal histories often intersect, the endurance of such a case is particularly pronounced. People who had lived through the time of the incident carried with them not only the memory of what had happened, but also the emotional and social context in which it had unfolded. These memories did not remain static. They evolved, influenced by subsequent experiences and by the gradual reshaping of perspective that comes with time. Yet, even as they changed, they retained a core significance, serving as a reminder of how quickly stability can give way to disruption. This enduring presence affected how individuals approach situations involving tension or disagreement. There was a growing inclination to pause, to consider the possible consequences of actions, and to recognize the importance of de-escalation. These responses were not always conscious, but they reflected a shift in the underlying assumptions that guide behavior. Where once there may have been a tendency to dismiss certain conflicts as inconsequential, there is now a greater awareness that even small interactions can carry the potential for escalation under the right conditions. Among younger members of the community, this awareness was transmitted not through direct experience, but through the accumulated knowledge and attitudes of those around them. The case of Makani Ray Dickerson became part of a broader narrative about decision-making and consequence, one that was communicated through both formal education and informal conversation. In this way, the case continued to influence behavior indirectly, shaping how new generations understood the dynamics of conflict and the importance of managing it responsibly. Educational institutions remained central to this process, integrating lessons about communication, emotional awareness, and conflict resolution into their programs. These efforts were informed by a recognition that understanding behavior requires more than theoretical knowledge. It requires practical skills, the ability to navigate complex social situations, and the capacity to respond thoughtfully under pressure. The legacy of past cases, including this one, contributed to the emphasis placed on these skills, reinforcing their importance in maintaining a safe and supportive environment. Community initiatives also continued to reflect the influence of the case, focusing on creating opportunities for engagement and support. These initiatives were not static. They evolved in response to changing needs and new insights, but their underlying purpose remained consistent. They sought to strengthen the connections within the community, to provide resources for those facing challenges, and to create spaces where issues could be addressed before they escalated. The case served as a reminder of why such efforts are necessary, reinforcing the importance of proactive rather than reactive approaches. For the families involved, the enduring presence of the case was experienced in a more personal and immediate way. Time provided distance, but it did not remove the connection to what had occurred. Instead, it allowed for a gradual process of integration, where the past became part of an ongoing narrative rather than a defining moment that existed in isolation. This process is complex and deeply individual, shaped by personal reflection, relationships, and the passage of time. Within the broader community, the case also influenced how people thought about accountability. The legal process had established responsibility within a specific framework, but the broader implications of that responsibility continued to be considered over time. There was a growing recognition that accountability extends beyond individual actions to include the conditions that allow those actions to occur. This perspective encouraged a more comprehensive approach to addressing conflict, one that considers not only the immediate circumstances, but also the underlying factors that contribute to escalation. As the case became more distant, it also became more abstract. The specific details that had once dominated discussion gradually faded, replaced by a more general understanding of what the case represented. This abstraction did not diminish its importance. Rather, it allowed the case to be applied to a wider range of situations. It became a lens through which other events could be interpreted, providing a framework for understanding how conflict develops and how it can be managed. This process of abstraction is a natural part of how communities incorporate significant events into their collective memory. By focusing on broader themes rather than specific details, the community is able to retain the lessons of the case while allowing the immediate emotional intensity to subside. This balance is essential for long-term resilience, enabling individuals to move forward while still acknowledging the impact of the past. In the context of Maui's ongoing development, the case contributed to a broader awareness of the need for balance between tradition and change. As the community continues to evolve, influenced by both internal dynamics and external factors, the lessons drawn from past events provide a foundation for navigating new challenges. The Makani Ray Dickerson case, while rooted in a specific moment in time, became part of this foundation, informing how the community approaches issues of safety, communication, and support. The role of reflection in this process cannot be overstated. Over time, the ability to look back on the case with a degree of distance allows for a deeper understanding of its implications. This reflection is not limited to formal settings. It occurs in everyday conversations, in moments of personal contemplation, and in the decisions people make in their daily lives. Through this ongoing process, the case continues to influence the community in ways that are both subtle and significant. At the same time, the persistence of unanswered questions remains a defining aspect of the case. While the legal process provided conclusions within its own framework, the broader understanding of the event remains incomplete. This incompleteness is not a failure, but a reflection of the complexity of human behavior. It serves as a reminder that not all aspects of an event can be fully explained, and that some degree of uncertainty is an inherent part of understanding the world. For many, this uncertainty becomes a point of reflection rather than frustration. It encourages a more thoughtful approach to interpreting events, one that acknowledges complexity and avoids oversimplification. In this way, the case contributes to a more nuanced perspective on conflict and behavior, one that recognizes the interplay of multiple factors and the difficulty of drawing clear boundaries between them. As the years continue to pass, the Makani Ray Dickerson case remains present not as a focal point, but as an underlying influence. It is part of the collective memory that shapes how the community understands itself and its experiences. This presence is not always visible, but it is consistently felt, informing attitudes and perspectives in ways that may not always be immediately apparent. In the end, the significance of the case lies not only in what happened, but in how it has been remembered and interpreted over time. It serves as a reminder of the fragility of stability, the importance of awareness, and the ongoing need for communication and support within a community. These lessons are not confined to a single moment or place. They extend beyond the specifics of the case, offering insights that remain relevant as the community continues to grow and change. Through this enduring influence, the case becomes more than a historical event. It becomes part of the living narrative of Maui, a story that continues to shape the present even as it recedes into the past. And in that ongoing presence, it retains its significance, not as something to be revisited constantly, but as something that quietly informs the way people think, act, and relate to one another in the years that follow. As the years continued to layer distance over the events of 2010, the Makani Ray Dickerson case became something that existed less in active recollection and more in the structure of understanding that people carried with them. It was no longer necessary to recall the sequence of events in detail for its influence to remain present. Instead, the case had become part of a deeper awareness, one that shaped how individuals interpreted behavior, risk, and responsibility in ways that were often subtle and unspoken. In this stage, the case functioned almost like a reference point embedded within the collective consciousness, guiding perception without requiring direct attention. In Maui, where the rhythm of life is closely tied to community interaction and shared experience, such embedded memories take on a particular significance. They are not stored separately from daily life, but are woven into it, influencing how people respond to situations as they arise. The Makani Ray Dickerson case became one of these woven elements, contributing to a broader sense of attentiveness that extended across generations. This attentiveness was not characterized by fear, but by a quiet recognition of the potential for change within even the most ordinary circumstances. For individuals who had been present during the time of the case, the memory had evolved from something immediate and emotionally intense into something more reflective. The passage of time allowed for a gradual recontextualization, where the initial shock was replaced by a more measured understanding of what had occurred. This process did not erase the emotional impact, but it altered its form, making it less overwhelming while preserving its significance. In this way, memory became both a record of the past and a tool for navigating the present. The influence of the case could be seen in the way people approach conflict, particularly in situations where emotions ran high. There is an increased tendency to consider the broader implications of actions, to recognize that moments of tension can develop in unpredictable ways, and to prioritize de-escalation wherever possible. These responses were not always conscious decisions, but they reflected a shift in the underlying framework through which behavior was interpreted. The case had contributed to this shift not by dictating specific actions, but by altering the way people thought about the consequences of those actions. Among younger generations, the transmission of this awareness occurred through a combination of formal and informal channels. The case itself was not always presented in detail, but its themes were integrated into broader discussions about responsibility, communication, and the management of conflict. In schools, these discussions took the form of programs designed to develop emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. In everyday life, they emerged through conversations with family members, mentors, and peers who conveyed their understanding of the importance of thoughtful decision-making. Educational institutions continued to play a central role in shaping this understanding. The emphasis on conflict resolution and emotional awareness remained a consistent part of the curriculum, reflecting a recognition that these skills are essential for navigating complex social environments. The influence of past events, including the Makani Ray Dickerson case, was evident in the priority given to these topics. The goal was not to dwell on the past, but to use its lessons as a foundation for building a more resilient future. Community organizations also sustained their efforts to create supportive environments where individuals could address challenges before they escalated. These efforts were grounded in the understanding that prevention requires ongoing engagement, not just reactive measures. By providing resources, fostering connections, and encouraging open communication, these organizations contributed to a culture that values awareness and intervention. The case served as a reminder of the importance of these efforts, reinforcing the need for continuous attention to the factors that influence behavior. For the families directly involved, the passage of time brought a different kind of continuity. The legal proceedings had long since concluded, but the personal impact of the case remained an integral part of their lives. This impact was not static. It evolved as individuals adapted to new circumstances and redefined their relationship with the past. The process of moving forward did not involve forgetting, but rather integrating the experience into a broader narrative that allowed for growth and change. Within the wider community, the case contributed to an ongoing conversation about accountability. While the legal system had established responsibility in a formal sense, the broader implications of that responsibility continued to be explored. There was an increasing recognition that understanding such events requires looking beyond individual actions to consider the context in which they occur. This perspective encouraged a more holistic approach to addressing conflict, one that takes into account the interplay of social, emotional, and environmental factors. As the case became more distant, it also became more symbolic. The specific details that had once defined it were gradually replaced by a set of broader meanings that could be applied to other situations. This symbolic dimension allowed the case to remain relevant even as its immediate context faded. It became a way of thinking about conflict, escalation, and consequence, rather than a fixed narrative tied to a specific moment in time. This transformation into symbolism is a natural part of how communities process significant events. By abstracting the core elements of a case, individuals are able to apply its lessons more broadly, using it as a framework for understanding new experiences. In this way, the Makani Ray Dickerson case continued to influence thought and behavior, not through detailed recollection, but through the principles it came to represent. At the same time, the case underscored the importance of humility in the face of complexity. Despite thorough investigation and legal resolution, it remained clear that not all aspects of the event could be fully understood. This acknowledgement of uncertainty became part of the case's legacy, encouraging a more cautious and thoughtful approach to interpreting similar situations. Rather than seeking definitive answers, there was a growing appreciation for the nuanced and often ambiguous nature of human behavior. In Maui, this appreciation contributed to a culture that values reflection and dialogue. Conversations about conflict, responsibility, and community dynamics became more open and inclusive, allowing for a range of perspectives to be considered. This openness is an important aspect of resilience, as it enables individuals to learn from the past while remaining adaptable to the future. As the years continued to pass, the case settled into a stable position within the collective memory of the community. It was no longer a source of active discussion, but remained accessible as a point of reference when needed. This accessibility ensured that the case could continue to inform thought and behavior, even as new events and challenges emerged. In a broader context of Hawaii, the Makani Ray Dickerson case became part of a larger narrative about youth and violence. It was one of many cases that contributed to an ongoing effort to understand and address the factors that lead to such incidents. This effort is continuous, shaped by new information and changing circumstances, but is grounded in the lessons learned from past experiences. Ultimately, the enduring significance of the case lies in its ability to influence without dominating. It does not require constant attention to remain relevant, because its lessons have been internalized and integrated into the way people think and act. This quiet influence is perhaps its most lasting legacy, ensuring that the impact of the case continues to be felt even as it recedes further into the past. In this way, the Makani Ray Dickerson case remains a part of Maui's identity, not as a defining event, but as a contributing element in the ongoing process of understanding and growth. It serves as a reminder that even the most difficult experiences can lead to deeper awareness, and that this awareness, once established, can continue to shape the future in meaningful ways. As the passage of time continued to widen the distance between the present and the events of 2010, the Makani Ray Dickerson case entered a phase where its meaning became increasingly layered, shaped not only by memory, but by interpretation. It was no longer defined by a single narrative or a fixed understanding, but by the accumulation of perspectives that had developed over the years. Each retelling, each reflection, added a new dimension, allowing the case to exist not as a static record, but as an evolving part of the community's collective consciousness. In Maui, where shared experience forms a central part of identity, this evolution carried particular weight. The case had become one of those moments that quietly influenced how people understood the nature of their environment. It was not invoked in every discussion, nor did it dominate public awareness, but it remained present in the underlying assumptions that guided behavior. This presence was subtle, often unspoken, yet it shaped the way individuals approached interactions, especially in situations where emotions or disagreements were involved. One of the most enduring aspects of the case's legacy was the shift it created in how conflict was perceived. Before the incident, conflict among young individuals might have been seen as a normal and manageable part of life, something that would resolve itself over time. Afterward, there was a greater recognition that even seemingly ordinary tensions could carry the potential for escalation. This recognition did not lead to avoidance of conflict, but it did encourage a more thoughtful and deliberate approach to addressing it. In practical terms, this meant an increased emphasis on communication. Conversations that might once have been delayed or avoided were now approached more directly, with an understanding that unresolved tension can develop in unpredictable ways. This shift was not always visible, but it represented a fundamental change in how people navigated their relationships. The case had contributed to this change by demonstrating the consequences of escalation, making the need for early intervention more apparent. Educational institutions continued to play a significant role in reinforcing these lessons. Programs focused on emotional awareness, communication skills, and conflict resolution remained integral to the curriculum, reflecting a long-term commitment to equipping individuals with the tools needed to manage complex social situations. These programs were not solely a response to any single event, but the influence of past cases, including the Makani Ray Dickerson case, was evident in the priority given to these areas. Within the community, there is also a growing appreciation for the importance of support systems. Families, friends, and community organizations all contributed to creating an environment where individuals felt able to seek help and address challenges before they escalated. This emphasis on support was not new, but it gained additional significance in the context of the case, which had highlighted the potential consequences of unresolved tension. By strengthening these networks, the community sought to reduce the likelihood of similar incidents in the future. For those who had been directly affected, the evolution of the case's meaning was a deeply personal process. The passage of time allowed for a gradual redefinition of their relationship with the past, one that incorporated both memory and adaptation. This process was not uniform. It did not follow a predictable path, but it reflected the broader human capacity to find ways of moving forward while carrying the weight of experience. The case remained a part of their lives, but it did not define them entirely. At a broader level, the case contributed to ongoing discussions about responsibility and accountability. While the legal system had provided a formal framework for determining responsibility, the community continued to explore what those concepts meant in a wider context. There was an increasing recognition that accountability extends beyond individual actions to include the conditions that shape those actions. This perspective encouraged a more comprehensive approach to understanding behavior, one that considers the interplay of personal, social, and environmental factors. As the case became more distant, it also became more abstract. The specific details that had once been the focus of attention gradually gave way to broader themes, allowing the case to be applied to a wider range of situations. This abstraction did not diminish its significance. Rather, it enabled the community to draw on its lessons in a more flexible and adaptable way. The case became a lens through which other events could be understood, providing a framework for interpreting conflict and its potential outcomes. This process of abstraction also contributed to a sense of continuity. While the immediate impact of the case had diminished, its influence persisted through the ideas and perspectives it had generated. These ideas became part of the community's shared understanding, shaping how people thought about safety, communication, and the importance of maintaining balance within relationships. In this way, the case continued to have an effect even as it receded further into the past. At the same time, the case underscored the importance of acknowledging complexity. Despite the conclusions reached through the legal process, it remained clear that not all aspects of the event could be fully explained. This acknowledgement of uncertainty became an important part of the case's legacy, encouraging a more nuanced approach to interpreting similar situations. Rather than seeking simple answers, there is a growing appreciation for the multiple factors that can influence behavior and the difficulty of drawing clear boundaries between them. In Maui, this appreciation for complexity contributed to a culture of reflection. Conversations about difficult topics became more open, allowing for a range of perspectives to be considered. This openness is an important aspect of resilience, as it enables individuals and communities to learn from the past while remaining adaptable to the future. The case played a role in fostering this openness, providing a point of reference for discussions about how to navigate challenging situations. As the years continued to pass, the Makani Ray Dickerson case became part of the broader narrative of the community's history. It was no longer a defining event, but it remained a significant one, contributing to the collective understanding of how communities respond to disruption. This understanding is not fixed. It evolves over time, shaped by new experiences and changing circumstances. The case remains part of this evolution, influencing how people interpret and respond to new challenges. In the context of Hawaii as a whole, the case also contributed to a wider conversation about youth and violence. It was one of many cases that highlighted the importance of addressing these issues in a comprehensive and proactive manner. This conversation continues to develop, informed by ongoing research, policy changes, and community initiatives. The Makani Ray Dickerson case remains part of this conversation, serving as an example of the complexities involved and the importance of continued effort. Ultimately, the enduring significance of the case lies in its ability to prompt ongoing reflection. It does not offer definitive answers or simple solutions, but it encourages a deeper consideration of how individuals and communities navigate conflict and responsibility. This reflection is an essential part of growth, allowing for a more informed and thoughtful approach to the challenges that arise in everyday life. As the story of the case settles into its place within the collective memory of Maui, it continues to influence the present in subtle but meaningful ways. It shapes how people think about their relationships, how they approach moments of tension, and how they understand the balance between individual actions and collective responsibility. This influence is not always visible, but it is consistently present, guiding behavior and perspective in ways that extend beyond the specifics of the case. In this sense, the Makani Ray Dickerson case is not simply a story of the past, but a living part of the community's ongoing narrative. It remains relevant not because of the details of what happened, but because of the insights it provides into the nature of human interaction and the importance of awareness in maintaining stability. Through this enduring presence, it continues to shape the way people understand their world, offering a quiet but persistent reminder of both the fragility and resilience of the communities they inhabit. In the longest arc of its existence within public memory, the Makani Ray Dickerson case ultimately became something that transcended its original boundaries, no longer confined to the specific time, place, or individuals directly involved. It evolved into a kind of enduring reflection point, one that continued to shape thought and perception not through repetition, but through quiet persistence. By this stage, the case was no longer something people needed to revisit in detail to understand its significance. Instead, it had been absorbed into a broader awareness of how fragile ordinary life can be and how quickly it can shift under certain conditions. In Maui, this transformation was particularly meaningful because of the way community identity is built around continuity, familiarity, and shared experience. Events that disrupt, that continuity tend to leave a lasting imprint, not because they are constantly discussed, but because they become part of the underlying narrative that defines how people understand their environment. The Makani Ray Dickerson case became one of those defining elements, existing not as a dominant story, but as a subtle influence that shaped how individuals interpreted both past and present. At this stage, the memory of the case had settled into a form that was less about emotion and more about perspective. The intensity that had once accompanied it had softened, replaced by a quieter, more reflective understanding. This did not mean that the case had lost its importance. On the contrary, it meant that its significance had deepened, moving beyond immediate reaction into a space where it could inform long-term thinking. People no longer engaged with it as a singular event, but as part of a larger pattern of human behavior and community response. One of the most enduring aspects of this perspective was the recognition of how interconnected actions and consequences can be. The case illustrated that decisions made in moments of tension can have far-reaching effects, extending far beyond the individuals directly involved. This understanding became part of how people approach their own interactions, encouraging a greater awareness of the potential impact of their actions. It was not a matter of constant caution, but of a more grounded sense of responsibility. This sense of responsibility extended beyond individuals to the community as a whole. Over time, there was a growing recognition that maintaining stability requires collective effort. Families, schools, and community organizations all play a role in creating environments where conflict can be addressed constructively. The case contributed to this recognition by highlighting the consequences of situations where such support is not sufficient or does not intervene in time. In response, there was a sustained emphasis on strengthening these networks, ensuring that individuals have access to the resources and support they need. Among younger generations, the legacy of the case was carried forward through the values and practices that had developed in its aftermath. Even those who had no direct connection to the events of 2010 were influenced by the cultural shifts that followed. They grew up in an environment where communication, emotional awareness, and conflict resolution were given greater importance, and where the potential consequences of escalation were more clearly understood. In this way, the case continued to shape the future, not through direct memory, but through the systems and attitudes it had helped to influence. Educational systems remained a central part of this process, providing structured opportunities for individuals to develop the skills needed to navigate complex social situations. These systems were informed by a growing body of knowledge about behavior and conflict, as well as by the experiences of past cases. The Makani Ray Dickerson case was one of many that contributed to this knowledge, serving as an example of how quickly situations can change and how important it is to be prepared for those changes. At the same time, the case underscored the limits of prevention and understanding. Despite all efforts to identify patterns and implement safeguards, there remains an element of unpredictability in human behavior. This reality does not diminish the importance of prevention, but it does highlight the need for humility in the face of complexity. The case serves as a reminder that not all outcomes can be anticipated or controlled, and that even the most well-prepared communities can face unexpected challenges. For those who had been directly affected, the long-term perspective brought a different kind of clarity. While the immediate pain and confusion of the early days had evolved over time, the significance of the experience remained. It became part of how they understood themselves and their place within the community, shaping their perspectives in ways that could not be easily separated from the rest of their lives. This integration of experience is a defining aspect of how individuals adapt to significant events, allowing them to move forward while maintaining a connection to the past. Within the broader community, the case also contributed to an ongoing process of reflection about how justice is understood and applied. The legal system had provided a structured resolution, but the deeper questions about intent, responsibility, and consequence continued to resonate. These questions did not necessarily have definitive answers, but they encouraged a more thoughtful approach to interpreting similar situations. This ongoing reflection is an important part of how communities evolve, allowing them to adapt their understanding in response to new experiences. As the Makani Ray Dickerson case became further integrated into the collective memory, it also became part of a larger narrative about resilience. It demonstrated not only the capacity for disruption, but also the ability of a community to respond, adapt, and continue forward. This aspect of the case is often less visible than the initial event, but it is equally important. It highlights the strength that emerges in the aftermath of difficulty and the ways in which communities can learn and grow from challenging experiences. In Maui, this sense of resilience is closely tied to the concept of connection. The relationships that bind individuals together also provide the foundation for recovery and adaptation. The case, while disruptive, ultimately reinforced the importance of these connections, encouraging a renewed focus on maintaining and strengthening them. This emphasis on connection remains a central part of the community's identity, shaping how it responds to both challenges and opportunities. Over time, the Makani Ray Dickerson case has become less about the specifics of what happened and more about what it represents. It stands as a reminder of the complexity of human behavior, the importance of awareness, and the need for ongoing effort in maintaining stability within a community. It is not a story that demands attention, but one that offers insight when considered, providing a deeper understanding of how individuals and communities navigate the challenges they face. In its final form, the case exists as part of the ongoing narrative of Maui, a story that continues to influence thought and perspective even as it recedes into the past. It is remembered not for the details alone, but for the lessons it carries, and for the way those lessons have been integrated into the fabric of the community. This integration ensures that the case remains relevant, not as a source of ongoing attention, but as a foundation for understanding. And so, the story does not truly end. It continues in the choices people make, in the way they approach conflict, and in the awareness they bring to their interactions. It lives on in the systems that have been strengthened, the conversations that have evolved, and the perspectives that have been shaped over time. In this way, the Makani Ray Dickerson case becomes more than a moment in history. It becomes part of the living experience of the community, a quiet but enduring presence that continues to guide, inform, and remind.